She stood on the wooden platform with the paper trembling in her hands, the edges soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, her breath shallow as the distant whistle of the train cut through the dry evening air, because this was supposed to be the moment her life finally became secure, finally became safe, the moment promised by ink and stamps and official words that said a man would arrive who was bound to her by law, by duty, by agreement, not by affection yet but by necessity, and as the locomotive hissed and slowed, iron screaming against iron, she felt the weight of every lonely night that had led her here, every prayer whispered into the dark of a small room where the walls were thin and the future thinner, and when the train finally groaned to a stop and the doors opened, she searched faces for kindness, for normalcy, for anything that looked like the quiet husband she had imagined, a man who would step down with uncertainty in his eyes and hope in his chest, not fear in his hands, but then she saw him, tall and heavy with a presence that made the air feel tighter, dressed in black like a shadow-given flesh, a long coat brushing against his boots, a hard hat pulled low, and in his hand a gun that did not waver as he stepped onto the platform, and the paper slipped slightly in her fingers as the world tilted, because this was not what she ordered, not what she had been promised, not what she had begged God for, and the words tore from her throat before she could stop them, raw and broken, echoing against the station walls as she cried that she had ordered a husband, not a stranger with a gun. And the man did not flinch, did not raise the weapon, did not even quicken his pace as he walked toward her, his boots heavy on the boards, each step sounding like a verdict, and behind him the train exhaled steam like a beast tired of carrying secrets, while the few people scattered around the station pretended not to see, not to hear, because out here survival often meant minding your own misery, and she felt suddenly exposed, like a wound left uncovered, as his shadow stretched toward her and swallowed her feet. And when he finally stopped a few steps away, close enough that she could see the lines etched deep into his face, scars not just on skin but in the eyes, she realized he was older than she expected, older than the hopeful image she had built, his gaze steady, unreadable, as if he had learned long ago not to waste emotion on moments that could turn dangerous, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke, the silence thick and suffocating, until he slowly lowered the gun, not putting it away, just letting the barrel point toward the ground. A small mercy that felt like a lifeline, and his voice when he finally spoke was rough but calm, carrying no mockery, no anger, only a weary certainty as he said her name, pronouncing it carefully as if it mattered, and she nodded because denying it would have been useless, and he told her he was there because he had agreed to be, because the papers were signed and the money exchanged, and because sometimes people like them did not get the luxury of choosing how things began, and her chest burned as she listened. Because his words made sense in a cruel, practical way, but sense did not make fear disappear, and she asked him why he carried a gun, her voice barely holding together, and he answered honestly, telling her that the world they lived in was not gentle, that roads were dangerous, that promises were often broken with bullets instead of words, and that he had learned the hard way never to arrive anywhere unarmed, and she wanted to tell him she had hoped for gentleness. That she had dreamed of a man who would arrive with flowers or at least an awkward smile, but the words stayed trapped inside her because survival had taught her too that dreams were expensive, and as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for the moment, he offered to carry her bag, a simple gesture that felt strangely heavy, and when she hesitated he did not push, did not reach for it, just waited, and that waiting, that respect of her space, confused her more than force would have. And finally she handed it over, because standing still forever was not an option, and together they walked away from the platform, the distance between them small but filled with unspoken questions, toward a wagon waiting near the station, and as they climbed aboard, she wondered if she had just stepped into safety or into something far darker, and the ride to his land was long and quiet, the wheels creaking over dirt roads as the last light faded, and she watched the landscape pass by, wide and empty, thinking about how small her life had always been and how suddenly enormous it felt, and when they finally reached the house, a modest structure standing alone against the vastness, she felt her stomach twist, because this was to be her home now, and he showed her inside without ceremony, lighting a lamp, pointing out where she could sleep, where water was kept, where food was stored, speaking like a man listing supplies rather than welcoming a wife. And she told herself she should be grateful that he did not demand anything of her that night, that he left her alone to cry silently into a pillow, clutching the letter that had brought her here, but gratitude was complicated, tangled with fear and disappointment, and the days that followed did little to ease that confusion, because he rose early and worked hard, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark, always with the gun, always quiet, and she learned his routines the way one learns the habits of a storm, cautiously, from a distance, and yet there were moments that cracked the image she had built of him as a walking threat, moments when he fixed a broken chair without being asked, when he left extra firewood near the door, when he placed food on the table for her before eating himself, and these small acts unsettled her more than cruelty would have, because they forced her to confront the possibility that the stranger with a gun was not entirely a stranger to decency, and still she kept her guard up, because kindness could be another kind of weapon, and one evening, weeks after his arrival, she finally asked him why he had agreed to this arrangement, why a man like him would bind himself to someone he did not know, and he stared into the fire for a long time before answering, telling her that he had lost too much already to believe in love, that loneliness had become a familiar companion, but that a man alone in this world was often seen as a problem, a threat, someone to be feared or chased away, and that marriage, even one born of paperwork rather than romance, offered a kind of legitimacy, a shield, and she realized then that they were both using this union as armor against a harsh world, and that realization did not bring comfort, but it brought understanding, and understanding was the first fragile bridge between them, and slowly, cautiously, they began to speak more, not about dreams or feelings, but about practical things, about the land, the seasons, the dangers, and through these conversations she learned that the gun was not an extension of cruelty but of survival, that he had seen things she could not imagine, had buried people whose names he still carried like scars, and one night, when a storm tore through the land and thunder shook the walls, she found herself sitting beside him, both of them awake, listening to the rain, and without thinking she reached for his hand, and he stiffened, then slowly relaxed, his grip rough but steady, and in that moment she understood that fear could coexist with trust, that safety did not always look like softness, and yet the past does not release its hold easily, and when trouble finally came, riding in on the backs of men who saw opportunity in isolation, who saw a lone house and thought it easy prey, she learned why he never set the gun down, because the night exploded with shouting and fear, and she cowered in the darkness while he stood between her and the danger, his movements precise, his voice commanding, and when it was over and the attackers fled or fell, she was shaking so badly she could barely stand, and he knelt in front of her, checking her for injuries with hands that trembled just as much, and she realized then that the stranger with a gun had become the man who would stand in front of a bullet for her, and that knowledge broke something open inside her, and in the quiet aftermath, as dawn crept in and painted the destruction with pale light, she wept not just from fear but from the weight of everything she had misjudged, and he sat beside her, not touching this time, just present, and presence, she learned, was sometimes the deepest form of care, and as weeks turned into months, the sharp edges of their arrangement softened, not into a fairy tale, not into sudden passion, but into something sturdier, built from shared labor, shared danger, shared silence, and she began to see the man beneath the coat, beneath the gun, a man shaped by loss and responsibility, and he began to see her not as an obligation delivered by train, but as a person with resilience and quiet strength, and one evening, as they watched the sun sink behind the hills, he apologized for the day he arrived, for the fear he had caused without intending to, and she surprised herself by saying she was glad he had come, gun and all, because without him she might not have survived what followed, and they sat there, the past still heavy but no longer suffocating, understanding that life rarely delivers what is ordered, that sometimes what arrives looks terrifying and wrong, but contains within it the very thing needed to endure, and though she would never forget the moment she cried out on that platform, she came to see it not as the beginning of a mistake, but as the beginning of a story that taught her strength, taught her discernment, taught her that safety is not the absence of danger but the presence of someone willing to face it with you, and as the seasons changed and the land bore witness to their quiet perseverance, she folded the paper that had started it all one last time and placed it away, no longer a symbol of desperation, but a reminder that even the most frightening arrivals can lead to unexpected survival, and that sometimes the stranger with a gun becomes the husband who guards not just your life, but your fragile hope for tomorrow.